Okay, so welcome. Welcome to those of you signing on here in the States where where I am, it's a beautiful sunny Saturday morning. I know some of you on the East Coast, I think, are in the throes or hopefully coming out of a snowstorm. I am thrilled and honored to be welcoming Andrew Samuels from across the pond, as they say, where it is Saturday early evening in Great Britain, in London, in Andrew's time. I'm really excited about this conversation and about what I know Andrew will bring to this conversation in terms of the depth and breadth and relevance of his own significant body of work in the world. Before I start with that, I'd like to just welcome all of you to this second in a series of what we have called the Sophia Talks, which I am offering as a complimentary series as an introduction to the newly launched Sophia Center for Transformative Learning. I am Loralee Scott, the director and founder, and I am thrilled and honored to be partnering with a community of, I think, amazing people, scholars, authors, artists, analysts, clinicians, who are all coming together around a held vision for being able to offer what we're calling integrative studies of psyche and soul in both an online format as well as in-person formats. And just to give you a real quick synopsis on why the Sophia Center, what makes it perhaps unique, I think just a couple of the most important things to hold is that really what the Sophia Center is about, and that's why Sophia is, it's about establishing and developing what I'm calling learning communities. And that word community is very, very important because it is about an interdisciplinary study that prioritizes not only the theoretical, but also the somatic, the intuitive, the creative, and the relational as key pieces to transformational learning, that we come together in community, that we find a way to use the technology to create that sense of community that I think arguably we can say we've lost, going back here in the States. I mean, Andrew, Great Britain, you'd go much farther back, but here in the States, going back to the times of the sewing bees and the barn raisings where everyone collectively came together around a common goal. And there was that sense of community. That's part of the temenos of the Sophia Center. Yes, it is about theoretical learning and the academics, but yes, it's also about creative engagement. And yes, it's also about getting to know the people, not only the sage on the stage that's got a wealth of information to impart, but the collective learning that happens when we come together and share our lived experiences. So I am really excited. It's also about finding new ways to offer platforms to others to be able to share their work and to get their work out there in the world. So there's a two-prong, both a learning and also an opportunity to offer a platform to share learning. This morning, I am so excited, thrilled, and honored to be able to, I'm saying introduce, I'm sure for many of you, it's a reintroduction. Many of you that are with us this morning, I'm sure have either read some of Andrew's books or are familiar with his work or have listened to him lecture and teach. Andrew Samuels is internationally recognized as one of the foremost theorists in analysis, psychotherapy, and depth psychology. His work draws on a wide range of approaches to psyche, including post-Jungian, relational psychoanalytic, and humanistic ideas. He roots his work in people's lived experience in their families and society. He's a training analyst of the Society of Analytical Psychology in private practice in London. He's the professor of analytic psychology at University of Essex, and he's the chair of the UK Council for Psychotherapy. He founded Psychotherapists and Counselors for Social Responsibility. He's worked extensively as a consultant with political leaders, parties, and activist groups in several countries, and he consults to Britain's National Health Service. You can find Andrew at www.andrewsamuels.com. And one thing I want to say, I'd like to say before I turn this over to Andrew is one of the things that I've appreciated in getting to know, and I've gotten to know Andrew primarily through an online forum that he originated, started, and founded, that I've been privileged to be a part of. One of the things I've so appreciated is when you read his writings, Andrew, one of the things I most appreciate, I think, about you is that you place work in the world. One, there's a passion to the way in which you place your work in the world, but your work in the world has always, from what I've seen, had a held consciousness of the marginalized other. You're always conscious and empathetic to the voice or the voices that may not be given a voice historically and traditionally. And that's something that I really appreciate about you. So I want to thank you for bringing your scholarship here to all of us this morning, and welcome you.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
So we're going to start right out of the gate with a little question. How do you see the future of Jungian analysis and Jungian psychology? Now, Andrew gave me this question for those of you who are like, Loralee, are you kidding? So Andrew, you kind of set yourself up for this one, but how do you see the future of Jungian analysis and Jungian psychology?
Well, I like to imagine a balance sheet with assets on the one hand and liabilities on the other hand. The thing is that if Jungian psychology and Jungian analysis is really going to have a future and not just be a small cult, or we could even call it a ghetto, it has to attend to the liabilities more than to the assets. The assets contain things we know and approve of, a focus on meaning and purpose, clinical work that is truly relational and real, and an understanding of gender that is far more sophisticated than critics give it credit for. But there are some serious liabilities. Why is Jung scarcely studied in the Western universities? Why does psychoanalysis and psychoanalysts still refer to Jung as a split-off, errant disciple of Freud? Why do so many critics stress the anti-Semitism, the racism, the sexism, and the elitism? You see, if the kind of outreach that both you and I are interested in, Loralee, is going to happen, we have to address those liabilities. Now, I began in the area of gender, and then it moved on to sexual orientation, and then it moved on to anti-Semitism, and I wrote perhaps more than anybody about Jung and anti-Semitism. I think we've done a fairly good job in responding to these criticisms and admitting where they're valid. Right now, and this is especially relevant to the United States, where you are racially divided, Jung is not seen as a contributor to a contemporary, compassionate, responsible discourse on ethnicity and raciality. He just isn't. You don't have to descend to the level of was Jung racist or not, because that's pretty pointless. But it behoves Jung's followers, the post-Jungians, to think about this. I think I'll leave my answer there. So what I'm really saying is, if there is to be a fecund and worthwhile future for what we probably all believe in, we have to pay attention to the downside. And right now, the numero uno downside in our field is race. Because what Jung wrote about Africans is not only casual racism, congruent with his time, but really quite developed, quite scientific. I won't, at this point, give chapter and verse. And I don't know how many people are responding positively to this. This is, of course, the problem of technology. I have no idea whether people are saying, well, the man's a complete idiot, or they're saying, great, somebody's actually raising this question. So I'll leave it there.
Well, regardless of the response, I think that your work in this area, and I know you've partnered with Fanny Brewster, who's been a part of some of our programming as well, relative to this. This is a desperately needed conversation, and one that is so relevant.
Yes, can I say that the role of white allies like me is something that we really need to talk about in the Jungian world now, because we have a very few people with whom to ally, Loralee.
Mm-hmm.
4 African-American Jungian analysts and 670 Jungian analysts in total. That's a fiasco. That's disgusting. That has to be attended to. And it is not enough to say, as senior colleagues say, well, anyone can attend a Jungian institute, trained to be an analyst. Fuck off, for God's sake. That's just nonsense. First of all, you need a whole pile of money. Secondly, if you are a person of color, would you really want to go and study that stuff that Jung writes about, where at times he's talking about Africans as if they're monkeys,
Mm-hmm.
or they lack a whole layer of consciousness? Would you want to do that? Is it fixable? Is an interesting question. And I move in and out of this. I mean, in my heart, I hope to God it's fixable. In my head, I really wonder, because so many Jungian analysts just don't get it.
Yeah, I mean, for those of you who are joining in, this is not the PG webinar, just to let you know. This is just raw and real with Andrew and Loralee, and I love your passion that comes through, and I think you're bringing up a really, really significant point.
Sorry, what's a PG webinar? I don't...
Parental guidance, like when you go to the movies, Andrew, it's a PG rating, you know, it means...
Oh, in this country, everybody swears. It is a mark of an intellectual to give up on language and
there are scientific studies that say swearing is a sign of intelligence, Andrew. So we'll leave it at that, okay? But I want to hone in on something that I think is so crucial to what you're saying, is this idea of the majority coming into alliance, and coming, more than just alliance, coming alongside of and advocating with those who have been exiled or who have been othered. And I'm going to throw this in here just because you know me well enough to know this is a big part of my work. I found this to be fascinating when I first dove into Jungian psychology a decade ago, and relative to when we talk about gender studies and we talk about feminism. I mean, and I just read, you did your own anecdotal study of 2,000 people where one of the #1 issues that comes up in the therapy room is along feminine gender issues. And yet, and I think of the work of Carol Gilligan, I think of the work of Judith Herman, but historically, other than yourself and a few exceptions, I think Rick Tarnas's work is an exception, the only people who are talking or putting that out there in the forefront are women analysts. I don't hear men talking about that as much at all, if at all. Very few. Yourself being one of those exceptions.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, the role for men like me is to stop men complaining that they're now the new victims and they want to get jobs and nobody will come and see them in the consulting room. Everybody wants to work with a woman. Poor guys. No, it's a really strange community, the community of Jungian analysts. If you compare it to other schools of psychotherapy or to academics or to activists, it's just another planet. This is difficult for me to say here, but I don't feel I need to be inhibited about this. There's something terribly problematic in the Jungian thing, which, if not addressed, will bring the temple down, because there's an awful lot of good stuff in that temple, really seriously is. And you know more about feminist issues than me, but on the question of ethnicity, race, otherness, we need to be very careful. Edward Said, who was one of the main writers about otherness and ethnicity and race, coined the term Orientalism, by which he meant apparently admiring, but actually rather patronizing and over-idealizing accounts of other cultures. So let's turn to China, let's turn to Japan, let's turn to Buddhism, let's turn to absolutely anywhere and think how marvelous it is, Ladakh or some Himalayan place. But what about our place, where people are sleeping on the streets? There are whole camps sleeping on the streets in Berkeley and Oakland that I've actually seen. Colossal. So before we get too excited about these others and head off to sweat lodges to cure our alcoholism and things like this, let's be very, very careful here. That said, that's a kind of typical professorial warning for which I make some apology, because ultimately respect for and learning from other cultures is the way to go. But don't tip over into this terribly snooty, patronizing approach. You know something? Those South African spirit healers, the Sagomas, wow, they work just like us Jungian analysts work. I mean, for goodness sake, they work like they work.
Okay, and and the other thing I just want to really make sure people are aware of too is, Andrew, there are two kinds of, I think, there categories of critics: those who stand outside and throw stones because they just simply want to deconstruct or destroy, and those who are passionately advocating from the inside. And that's where you come from, and I think that's
Absolutely.
important to hold on to, is that I think that takes a certain kind of courage and passion, because you want to see it thrive, not because you're trying to destroy it. And I just want to emphasize that, because that's another thing that I appreciate about you. All right, so we're just taking a quick bus stop on this, but let's go to this next question, which maybe we should have started with, but which is, and I know I hate getting asked these questions, but you gave me this question, so I'm going to ask you it. How do you identify yourself? Analyst, professor, writer, activist, or all of the above? I probably could weigh in on how you're going to answer this. And if it's all of the above, how does that work for you? How do you hold all these different hats?
Well, it doesn't mesh together very well.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't mind this. I mean, in America, you have two baseball leagues. In one baseball league, the pitcher can be a hitter. In the other baseball league, the pitcher cannot ever be a hitter. So the problematic here is about what we call in England the all-rounder. I think a term sometimes used in the States is an all-arounder. It means somebody who may not be brilliant at anything, but is pretty good at a wide range of things. That's my personal goal. I don't think I will ever be the best therapist, frankly, even though my main sort of tag for myself is a therapist. I try not to use words like analyst and patient, but therapist and client, because I don't really see the need to continue this elitist differentiation between the analytical therapies and all the others. But it seems to me that somebody like me, who is an academic and thinks, a thinking type. Actually, I'm not a thinking type, by the way. I am extraordinarily intuitive.
Well, intuitive and feeling, yeah.
Yes, insanely so. But it means that probably my academic stuff isn't that good either. It's good enough. Yeah, but this is very important. I'm doing a little bit of life coaching here.
Yeah.
I think it's good to have a bricolage of interests. And it's very important to try and find a supportive community that doesn't require you to specialize. And one of the things in industrial and post-industrial societies is there's a very high premium put on specialism. Medicine leads the way. But when you have a medical problem that people can't resolve via reference to specialist knowledge, generalist physicians, diagnostic physicians get called in, and they are probably not very good surgeons, not terribly good clinical physicians, but they have this all-round capacity. It's taken me into my early 70s to understand that I will not win every race, but I'd be very happy in a variety of different track and field events to come in the first 3 every time.
I think that's a great perspective to have. And I think, what you're sharing is, one, it's so in line with the Sophia Center in the sense of an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approach. I think it's also something that we're seeing constellated in the collective as well. I think relative to getting out of these narrow categorized silos, saying you have to stay in this lane. and coming into more of a consciousness that is really conscious of our interconnectedness, our interdependence, our interrelatedness, our ability to learn from each other and to learn
Yeah, but
across
hang
boundaries.
on. If you put your idea together with mine, or you put my idea together with yours, you will never be as interrelated and interconnected as you would like to be. You won't. Because in the all-around world, humility enters very early on.
Yeah.
So people who have holistic visions, people who are generalists, people who embrace the bigger thing, they may not be very good at a lot of the things that they undertake. And this is difficult because the seduction of technocratic specialism is pride and a certain kind of phallocentricity or phallic power. In this sense, it is a patriarchal device, whether applied to females or males, actually. So I think you've got that, and I think that's very difficult to get hold of. And I worry quite a lot, for example, when people start talking holistically about the climate crisis, that they want to become masters or mistresses of all the data, all the theories, all the technology, all the different, it's not possible.
Yeah.
You just have to steady down a bit, dial down.
Yeah.
If
Dial down.
I had to choose my epitaph, I would like it to be, he dialed down.
You're kidding me. Now that would be the last epitaph I would guess that you would select. He dialed down. Okay.
Yes. Well, you're supposed to select an epitaph that's contra life, contra your own life.
Well, that's new information to me, Andrew. But so tell me what you mean when you say he dialed down. What does that mean?
Well, it's partly age, but it's partly also developments in my own thinking about things. That instead of looking for perfection, instead of looking for individuation, actually, one might look for sort of smaller goals, where one makes connections, contributions, and so forth, and accepts that one might fail. This is the whole essence of good enoughness, which I know we're going to talk about in reference to leaders, which is one of my biggest interests. If you are a good enough person, then you will have dialed down, because you will have engaged thoroughly with the notion of the inevitability of failure and consequent disappointment.
You've got me thinking, because I've never thought of that term or heard it used that way. So let's go there into this idea of the good enough leader and this dial down. I mean, really, as I'm listening to you, when I'm hearing you talk about it, it's much less of an egocentric orientation, and more of a, I think, maybe a healthier orientation, a more realistic orientation.
I would leave the ego out, because that's technical jargon.
Yeah.
Language. Winnicott, Donald Winnicott, the British child psychoanalyst, coined this phrase "good enough" to refer to what happens when a baby realizes that mother or father simply cannot provide a perfect fit or a perfect environment at all times, and that they will fail. He uses the word fail again and again and again. And gradually, maturation involves human babies and children accepting that their parents are nothing more than good enough. This does not rule out, of course, the very high proportion of parents who are definitely not good enough.
Right.
But the perfect parent, who fits exactly with an omnipotent baby's desires and demands, doesn't exist. Now, take those words and apply them to political leadership. The perfect leader who fits the desires and expectations and wishes of the citizenry, whether individuals or groups, that leader doesn't exist. But we all play out a pretense that she or he does. And I remember I was working, I'll keep the names out, but you can figure it. I was working on a US presidential election campaign. And I was talking to the backroom boys, and they were all boys in those days, about good enoughness, about the need to place the inevitability of failure and the consequent management of disappointment absolutely as the central task of leadership. And they started to say, you know, you can't say this in the United States. You can absolutely not talk about failure. It's less true now than it was, but it's still very much true. We don't really, in this country either, value cannot do politicians, can't do politicians. We value the can do ones. And this is not much to do with gender, actually. It's got a lot to do with the demands of the system. So I've been thinking about good enough leadership where the task is to manage failure and the consequent disappointment. And then, of course, I got a chance to try this out in a more favorable environment, because it was very hard in American politics. But I mean, I got listened to, but not as much, not as much as I would have liked. But in working as a consultant with companies and with the National Health Service, with managers, with executives and things like this, they really are interested in this question of failure plus disappointment in themselves and in the people that they have responsibility for. So it's a funny application of a well-known piece of psychoanalytic thinking about families in much, much wider context. And I have to say, because I'm a naughty boy and I am a critic from the inside, there is not the slightest shred or trace of good enoughness in Jung. That's not, but to balance this, nor in Freud. It actually starts to become an appealing way of looking at life after the war, and I think after the Holocaust. Because the Holocaust suggests to us that we can only think in terms of failure and its consequent management. So I think the history of ideas is quite interesting. Would Winnicott have been able to think about good enoughness at any other time? Well, I don't know, do I? But the suggestion I'm making is that it reflects a post-Holocaust consciousness. And by the way, the world is completely caught in Holocaust consciousness to this day.
Yeah, we're in, I mean, Rick Tarnas refers to it as an apocalyptic consciousness, which is really that sense of an impending apocalypse is what I think so many.
Let me give you an example of how a complex works, if you want to call it a complex. People are arguing now that there were other Holocausts to consider, other genocides to consider, and this is absolutely right. But even to argue that, to seek parity between Armenia, Rwanda, and other situations, the Balkans, that puts everybody under the overarching Holocaust or Shoah complex. So I think this good enough stuff and living with failure is connected with the Holocaust, for me anyway.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, what you're bringing out, I just want to go a little bit further because I think it's so relevant. The way Winnicott, this coming to terms with the good enough parent, with the good enough leader, it is a necessary part of the individuation and of the individualization, because it mandates that the individual has to take on responsibility, has to assume responsibility, right? Because where I'm sitting here listening to you is, what is it, whether we're talking the American psyche, if there is such a thing, that, you know, that makes us resistant to the good enough leader? Is it because then that places more of the responsibility on the individual?
Okay, first of all, you're really spot on. I don't know whether we are completely in tune or whether you read it, but the next step is the good enough citizen.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, which is something I'll be presenting later this year. But I don't think we need to go there for the moment. The difficulty in discussing this in terms of politics is that we have to enter the area of what I call the heroic leader. And your current president is an example of a heroic leader, whether you agree or whether you don't agree.
Mm-hmm.
That's the game.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, there is a real, almost visceral, almost genital excitement created in the citizens, in the society, by a heroic leader. Now, they don't all have to be like Trump. They can be worse, like Hitler, or they can be much better, but still heroic, like Mrs. Thatcher,
Mm-hmm.
because this is not gender specific.
Right.
So you have a situation in which, sadly, these people, we call them populists, but it's not a psychologically vibrant phrase or way of thinking. These leaders excite the people below the belt.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that's very hard to discuss because it sounds as if one is pathologizing people, and I hope I'm not. What I'm trying to do is offer a depth psychological contribution to an understanding of why heroic leaders get away with their shit, because they do, and they are.
Mm-hmm.
I did a workshop here. It was after the Brexit referendum, which voted to leave the European Union, and also after Trump's election victory. And there were about 100 people, all of them psychotherapists. It was only open to psychotherapists, which I don't like, but it was. And they started talking, especially with regard to Trump. And these are sophisticated, highly educated, professional, self-aware UK registered psychotherapists, not fools. And eventually this question of a visceral, almost genital excitement that an awful man like that can generate got discussed. It was very moving and very, very difficult. I had sleepless night.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 I mean, this, you're speaking to, I think, a consciousness that's archetypally rooted, and it's unconscious more than it is conscious.
Yes, it's absolutely that. And also it affects people whose conscious position is rejection, rebellion, revolution, and so on. This is not about who supports who. This is about how X affects people.
Yeah. 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 And I mean, this is going back to some of what we had talked about with Rick Tarnas when we're looking globally. And I want to change direction in a minute and bring it more into the individual, but globally, this push and pull that we're watching play out on the global world stage politically, where you have the newly elected 34-year-old prime minister in Finland. You're seeing almost two antithetical models of political leadership at play on the world stage. They're very different.
Sorry. This is what I mean by idealization. I mean, I know about Finland a little bit. Okay, all 6 parties are led by women.
Mm.
But they still cannot get their paternity leave sorted out. The men don't take it. There's a high suicide rate and a hell of a lot of alcoholism, and the ethnic minorities in the north of the country have a terrible time. So I'm not saying Finland is the worst country. It may even be the best country, but there is no perfect country.
There is no perfect country, but I'm talking about patterns, collective patterns that are very different. It remains to be seen how this will play out, I think.
Actually, this is very interesting because it comes up a lot, and I've tried to learn from feminist political scientists about what happens to women when they achieve the pinnacles of power. And it's very difficult. It's very difficult to, you cannot leap out of patriarchy just by announcing it. It's so deep, it's so completely spinal in us, whatever our sexes are. So, my problem, and I'm sure it's a depressive problem, it's a personal depression, call it saturnine, call it sardonic, call it cynical, call it fucked up, I don't know. But when I hear anybody excited about the fact that 6 parties in Finland are led by women, immediately I go into some kind of rebellion. I don't like I don't like it.
You're triggered because what I'm talking about is not just Finland. What I'm talking about is New Zealand with Jacinda Ardern. What I'm talking about is Slovakia. What I'm talking about is possibly Greece. Is sitting back and watching to see, are these, and potentially in some ways Trudeau and Canada, it's not just a gender thing. Is there an evolution that we're seeing towards a more collaborative, influential, what I am articulating as a Sophia consciousness model of leadership? And that's not
Yes.
about romanticizing it or
Yes.
idealizing it.
Rather than get into the question exactly as you put it, but not at all forgetting it. One of the interesting things is a discussion about whether electoral politics is the politics that matters.
Mm.
Because all these examples you've given and all the ones I've given and the kind of work I did as a consultant to presidential candidates or to Tony Blair when he was prime minister, I worked for him for 4 years. All of this is parliamentary or congressional or presidential, but it's fueled by the dominant model, which is electoral.
Right.
And there are other models. I mean, and this is not my invention. I mean, there are participatory, communal, social movement models. And many people, I'm sure, who are sitting with us in what feels increasingly like a kind of living room here, do that kind of politics.
Mm.
But what happens, especially at a time of an impeachment or an impending election and all the rest of it, is that we can't stop ourselves becoming caught up in the big politics. This is a huge and slow-moving development. But most of the political leaders that you've listed, that I've listed, that we admire, they don't go here because this is not what they do. They do elections. Primarily, they do elections, and elections, as we know, in Western societies are all mixed up with money.
Yeah.
So the question for therapists is how do we support non-electoral, we call it in Britain, extra-parliamentary, outside parliament politics? Because right now, with the government we have, that's the only kind of politics a bloke like me could possibly be interested in.
Right.
And I'm too old to do very much anyway. But the kids who are behind Extinction Rebellion, who are behind Black Lives Matter and numerous other initiatives, I think they have sussed, and it's not new because it was been there since socialism was invented, there is a real problem with representative democracy,
Yeah.
which is incredibly easy to throw it off. And that's what we're seeing.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you on that. I mean, looking at not just the world leaders in particular, but looking at the electoral systems. Yeah. And how are they empowered? So I want to go from here into a question, because I want to start bringing this back around, going from global to individual, right, to this conversation, because you have so much to add to this question. Is there a political self? And if so, how do we access it? Let's just start with the first part. This is a big question, and it's really important. Is there such a thing as a political self? How would you respond to that?
Well, I turn to Jung here, surprisingly. I mean, Jung had an idea about libido, energy, psychic energy, which was fundamentally neutral. It did what it wanted to do. So he talked about the religious instinct, and he also talked about the social instinct, which actually boils down to politics. So libido flows into a big variety of pathways or dried out riverbeds that it sort of wets in some way. Some of these are not so pleasant, violence, aggression, all that kind of thing. But some are very interesting. And one, I think, is the social or political track for psychic energy. If this is true, then there is a level or a domain in everybody's selfhood that is inherently political. Aristotle got there in 5 words or 6 words. Man, sorry, that's what he wrote. Man is by nature a political animal. And it's a very deep comment, especially the word animal. Nevertheless, this is where we therapists need to get our skates on. Because if we're talking about a political self that is omnipresent, then we need to be talking about writing about it, describing it, working with it clinically, looking at it when it's going well, when it's not going well. I'll give you an example from our profession. We never ask people, or we very rarely ask people when they make an application for training and have to go through these absurd interviews, totally ritualized, humiliating sort of things, which many people who are listening to this have probably been through. And people are very rarely asked, so have you been on a demonstration? When was the last march you went on? What were your mother's politics? Now you should start to be thinking, people who are listening to this, because this is an experiential element. I warned Loralee I was going to do it, and she encouraged me. When was the last political act you undertook? What was your mother's politics like? Or your father's politics? Sometimes parents have very different politics and children find it awfully difficult to navigate. Was that your experience? Or were your parents absolutely together politically? And that's very difficult as well. Last one, there are thousands of questions I could ask like this and appeal to you to reflect upon. How political are you? You know, I do an exercise. It's a sort of a joke, but it's become a very deep, I think jokes in education are really important. Mm-hmm. How political are you on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 means you're sort of politically catatonic and 10 means you're politically psychotic or something. So now you should be thinking, what number would I give if I could communicate my number? But then you'll be thinking, won't you? Well, it depends on context. This is where gender comes in. I ask people in workshops, are you more political when you're with a same-sex group? Are you more likely to engage in the political acts, debate, discussion about resources and power and leadership? Yes. Not just women, men too. Are you more political at home or in the workplace? And that's a fascinating one, especially when I'm working with people who run the National Health Service. Highly political, personally, privately, at home. Well, they leave that at home. They're middle of the road at work. I'll stop. But there are ways into a personal, individual exploration of your own political self.
But and these are fantastic questions that you're asking, and I'm sure everyone who's on and who will be listening to this recording, you know, they're a great opportunity for self-reflection and engagement, and they're important and necessary questions. But I want to lean into this idea of political self, because when I read that, I think I read it, I don't know if I read it in your book or in one of your essays, where I went with that is the idea and the ways in which, from my experience in working primarily in Seeing Red with women in Seeing Red, is the multiple nuanced ways in which we have internalized our self-identity has been politicized, been handed to us through a political venue, and it has been internalized. So anytime, it's impossible not to have a political sense. The question is, to what degree are we aware of it, and how do we sort out and sort through how much of our self-identity is politicized as opposed to authentic?
Wow. Well, the unconscious is unconscious. Mm-hmm. But one could ask, where did you get your politics from? What has influenced you, insofar as you know? Mm-hmm. And some of it will be family. An awful lot of people have had an enormous political mentoring experience from a school teacher, a minister or priest, a friend.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when I got into Camus, Albert Camus, a boy slightly older than me at school was clutching The Outsider.
Mm.
Me being me, I didn't read The Outsider. I read The Rebel.
So did I. Andrew's first Camus book I read was The Rebel. Big surprise there.
Yeah, I get it. Anyway, yeah. Anyway, the point I'm making is that people can be freed up to explore their whole political development by therapists as an act of therapy.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I never really agreed with Jim Hillman when he made the divide between a psychological investment in politics and clinical work. I think clinical work can carry forward the political project brilliantly, provided we don't get into the delusion that just doing therapy is political. It's not.
Right.
But therapy itself, with exploration of all of these things, which, by the way, are not much covered in people's trainings. They're not. I'm not saying they're completely absent, but they're not much covered. And certainly not and I travel a lot in the Jungian world, and this kind of political self-exploration is beginning to get going. And could I just say here, I hope I'm not talking too much, but the Jungian world is going through a political turn. It's quite incredible. Mm. We were known for our passivity, our introversion, our quietude, and even quiescence. Mm-hmm. We went along with things. We didn't stick our heads above barricades. All gone, changed. In so many countries, we are hearing about it in China, where Jungian analysts are reaching out to people going through all that one can imagine they're going through with the coronavirus. And our colleagues there have now reached 500 people. Mm-hmm. This is an activist form of Jungian therapy. It is, for those of you that know the word, it's an enantiodromia, a swing to the opposite. Mm-hmm. The group of therapists who wanted fuck all to do with politics has become obsessed with politics. Mm-hmm. And you can't go to a Jungian conference without people talking about politics. Yeah. And you'll see on the screen the next Jungian politics conference. It should have gone to all of you.
It is, and we'll get to that before we close. So
but it's a big, exciting moment for the Jungian communities worldwide.
But let me ask you this. I'm going to lob a really provocative question to you, okay? How do you, as a Jungian analyst, how do you work with someone who walks through your door, steps over your threshold with a totally different political orientation than you? How do you approach that? How do you navigate that?
Well, I virtually wrote a whole book about this, and I'm not sure I've got it right. You know I wrote about it, but I don't think you heard me say it's very difficult. First of all, if you're a therapist working at depth with people with complicated issues, you are touching some of the seamy or difficult sides of human nature anyway. Mm-hmm. You're working with people whose spiritual, sexual, relational styles are radically different from your own, and you don't feel comfortable with them. Mm-hmm. We do that. That's our work. Our work is to get burned. Our work is to manage our responses. So why is politics different? Answer: this does go back to the early days of depth psychology and psychoanalysis, where the outer world was not much included in thinking about how to do therapy. If you simply extend the range of things that you can engage with politically, then it becomes much easier to do it. Does it mean you always agree in the end? No, absolutely not. But you don't always agree about your client's marriage either. Mm-hmm. And clients do terrible things to their partners, which they tell you about. So sometimes clients tell you about terrible political views. And if you have a middle-class practice, as I do, and although I'm known as a lefty, fact is, I get people who come who work in banks, who don't want to pay taxes, who hate the idea of inheritance taxes, who think that the solution to inequality is that people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps and get on with life with a stiff upper lip and stop complaining, I have to negotiate all of that. And most lefty, or perhaps a better word is better used, is radical. Most radical therapists have been through this. Of course, I see a lot of people who come to somebody like me because they think we share the same politics. But that pretty soon collapses. So it is possible to do it. Now, I want to end with a slogan. You don't have to work on political stuff with every client all of the time. It comes and it goes. Just as a God experience is something that you might work intensively for months with somebody, and then nobody quite knows why, the focus moves to something else. So politics is not the be-all and end-all of therapy work, but a therapy that from the outset decides not to embrace the political. That's deeply problematic and actually out of date.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And could you say that I think that the ethics of the scenario revolve more around being in touch, especially as a Jungian psychoanalyst, rather than you're orienting around what the individual's unconscious is most in need of and where their unconscious is leading you. So you're seeking to follow that and help them come to peace or come to grips with whatever that peace may be. It's not about advocating for a particular political mindset.
Yeah, definitely. But you can't hide what your
Right.
political
But
mindset is.
you have to talk about it. Right. Right. So it's bringing it out of the closet. Yeah.
If people come into my waiting room, they see the Guardian newspaper. They think that makes me a fascist? Come on. Okay? Look at your room. Look at your room on this screen. It's beautiful. It's aesthetically pleasing. You ain't in the barrio, sister. Okay?
You never know. You get to see what's on the other side of my screen, Andrew.
Well,
you can't maybe, see.
Loralee, knowing you a little as I do, it could all be a stage set, but I don't think it is. What I'm trying to say is you can't hide, and
Exactly.
just as you can't hide your mannerisms, you can't hide your pheromones, you can't hide your smell.
So this issue or this mindset of the analyst being completely like you ever could be, completely neutral, and you don't reveal any part of yourself, and you sterilize the whole environment is what you're talking to.
Yeah,
right?
but look at Freud. I mean, if you went into Freud's little room where all the statues were, you think this guy is some kind of obsessive compulsive creep. Why? First of all, he has millions of them. Secondly, there's no shape. They're just pushed together. It's like a rock concert audience in the mosh pit or something. So he couldn't hide what he couldn't do.
Right.
And what Freud couldn't do was work with aesthetics, which Jung could do.
Yeah, and had to do. And I think you could say it was needed to do. All right. So Andrew, we could talk for 6 months. All right, so let's move on to one of the two last pieces, if we can squeeze. I'm looking at the clock. We might not be able to get them both in here, but two last questions.
I'll be quicker.
Okay, so one is you write about social spirituality. Can you tell our listeners what do you mean by a social spirituality?
Okay, I will come to it. Speaking as a therapist, there are some people that you see, and you may know socially out there in your friendship circles, who have never had the following experience. And this is nothing to do with left wing or right wing, because right wingers can have social spirituality too, as we sadly know. Some people have never been with others in a group, engaged on a political project, could be communal, could be local, could be national, could be international, could be very general, could be very specific. Some people have never had that experience. When you're with others, engaged in this political moment, it suddenly changes. And those of you that know the alchemical illustration of the dew or rain or liquid coming down, something descends on the group and it stops just being a task group oriented only towards social data and starts to become something transformative.
Mm-hmm.
Even if the subject is still collecting the garbage in the neighborhood,
Mm-hmm.
the feeling, the group feeling, is transformative. Now, here's the point. That's social spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
In Western societies, sadly, there are an awful lot of people who have never, ever experienced that. And it's a huge dysfunctional matter. So that's all I want to say. I imagine most people here have had that experience where there is this sort of alchemical transformation, an ordinary piece of boring political meeting suddenly elevates and becomes inspiring and real at a very deep level. But think about it. An awful lot of people haven't had that experience. And that's really where I started from when I was thinking about social spirituality.
I think it's fascinating what you're describing, and I'm relating to it not only politically. I mean, I know your background in theater. I'm thinking you experience that dynamic in theater as well. You experience it as a choreographer, experience it in the choreographic room. If I'm working in a retreat with a group of women where there's a group of individuals that come together around a shared and commonly held vision of something.
Yeah, but just be careful. Here's where my problem with idealization might come in. Unfortunately, the Nazis had this experience too. It depends. In the end, most political things start neutral, and then people make choices.
Mm.
So you
So
can
you're
have a
saying
winning.
social spirit, yeah, it works both ways. I mean, it doesn't matter the ideology, but there is a dynamic that happens
Yes,
around this. Okay.
yes, yes.
All right. So our last question, and then I will open it up for a few minutes to the group, is you have written about hope, and I love that you've written about hope, but you've written that hope cannot be achieved without contemplating risk. And I want us to end on this idea of hope, not in a saccharine way, but as I know, nothing you have to share is going to be shared in a saccharine way, but hope can't be achieved without contemplating risk. What do you mean by that?
Well, let me say, first of all, hope sometimes can't be achieved, period.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And
Mm-hmm.
I'd also want to say that insensate longing for the experience of hope is likely to be disappointed.
Mm-hmm.
That said, I've noticed that hope in the political area, which is what we're talking about, I think, hope in the political area depends on an active embrace of risk. And the case illustration I've been working on in terms of the influence on other people are people who self-immolate or otherwise kill themselves in pursuit of a political ideal or goal. Because for hope to be on the table, there has to be some telos, some point. And these individuals, whether it's the Buddhist monks in Vietnam or my particular choice, which is the young man Jan Palach
Mm-hmm.
in Czechoslovakia after the Soviet tanks came in 1968, who doused himself in petrol and set himself on fire. Now, is this an easy example of hope? No, it bloody isn't. It's a very difficult example of hope, but it means that somebody saw that something had to be done and could be done, even if it involved this kind of martyrdom or sacrifice. And by the way, hope comes in the practice of therapy too.
Mm-hmm.
When the accent, the pendulum swings into the risky area rather than the safe area, not into mothering, not into attachment, not into holding, but into something a little bit more scary and challenging. When people get into those states and get through them, then they are, in my view, sorry to use this word, kind of entitled to have hope
Mm-hmm.
because they've sort of earned it. So I wrote a paper, which I think you've read, in which I compared risk-taking in politics and risk-taking in therapy, and how both activities led to a summoning up of hope. But to return to the very first sentence in my reply to you, sometimes there just isn't any.
Well, there's that. Sometimes there just isn't any, and there is that realist and that realism that we have to be grounded in. But I love what you're sharing here, relative to contemplating, not only contemplating the risk, but really the individuals, the examples you gave, which are really difficult to even go to and look at those. I've never heard anyone frame those as hope, but you're really connecting.
Oh, look, if you're battling Ceausescu in Romania in 1969, or you're battling the regime in Chile in 2019 and 20, these kinds of self-sacrifices, risk-taking, are intricately interwoven with some vision of hope. Otherwise, why people wouldn't do it?
They wouldn't do it. So the fact that they're speaking out, I'm thinking of one of my favorite quotes from Camus, and I can't quote it exactly, where he writes, you know, in dangerous times, if art insists on being a luxury, it will also be a lie. Right.
Yes.
So that, you know, the hope lies in I think the degree to which each of us is able as individuals in our own process, in our own world, to lean into that place of chaos, to go to that abyss of chaos and to come through that. There is a necessary sacrifice in order to give birth to hope.
Camus said, I rebel, therefore we exist.
Well, Andrew, I can't say thank you enough. I have so thoroughly enjoyed this conversation and hope to have.
Well, you're amazing. I mean, you were just there in the interview, in the discussion. It's fantastic.
Well, thank you. It's really been our first opportunity, you and I, to actually talk face to face. So it's been delightful. And it's been, it's just what you bring to the table in terms of your scholarship and your unabashed courage and your own, I think, inherent archetypal connection to the revolutionary, really advocating for reform. That's hopeful for me, I think, and all of us moving forward. I want to open this up right now to any of you. If you'd like to, if you have a question for Andrew or a comment or anything, I realize it is still a Saturday early afternoon for those of us here in the States, but anything you'd like to share. And Andrew, while people are maybe typing in, do you want to comment? The link that you're seeing in the chat bar is a link to an upcoming conference. Andrew, what can you tell people? What can you tell us about the conference?
Yeah, the Young Institute of San Francisco does a conference every presidential election. The political group of Jungians called Analysis and Activism does regular conferences. We've brought the two together in Berkeley, California, October 15 to 18 this year, 2.5 weeks before your election. It will be one hot occasion. It's going to be held in the David Brower Center, which is a remarkably architecturally designed and environmentally blah, blah, all that. And if you can't come, you can pay the same money and live stream it. But this will be a terrific conference, which will bring together some of the things we've been talking about.
Wonderful. So for those of you who are listening live or who are going to be hearing this recording, there's still time to register and make your way there. The timing of it is phenomenal. And you know, some of what you've heard from Andrew will obviously, that's what this conference is bringing. And it's just, I think it's so needed and so necessary.
Loralee, I'm seeing comments in the chat bar. Is everybody?
Yes, we're seeing them. To everyone. Yes. So Pearl, thank you so much for sharing that. Can you read that, Andrew? Are you reading them?
Yeah, yes. Okay. Well,
go ahead.
You see, I have a piece of personal pathology, Pearl. When somebody writes something like that, I don't believe it. But thank you.
Well, that's what you need to work on, Andrew.
Yes. Is that all? Anyway, I sat with a hooded Hamas leader. Well, I think his answer kind of implied a series of steps of argumentation which he didn't give you, which is that why do you ask this question? Why is what I'm doing as a Hamas leader leading a violent resistance to Israeli occupation that is backed by the Western powers, why are you asking me, why do I do what I do? Isn't it obvious? Or rather, why don't you ask the people I've just mentioned? Why do they do what they do? So this goes back to Loralee's point, Kate, which is that our political unconsciouses are filled up with what we've been taught, what we've learned. The media plays a huge part in this. Is Hamas different? Is being hooded special if you don't want your face to be seen for obvious reasons? Listen, even in soccer matches now, because of the prevalence of people who can lip read, when the players and the managers and the coaches are talking, they do it like this so no one can see what they're saying. That's a hood. People wear hoods for good practical reasons. Scott, to everyone. There are many questions, yes. Yes. I mean, you know, the thing about these things is that I end up saying stuff that I know I definitely mean, but the way it comes out is to do with the relational context of the interviewer, of seeing all these names on the screen. Some I'm wondering, is the Lynn there, the Lynn I know? Things like that. Marilyn Matthew, who I suppose is Marilyn Matthew because the name is cut off, but she's a British Jungian, if that's who it is.
No, that's someone actually from the States. So there must be two
Okay, well,
Marilyn
that's
Matthews. Yeah.
so I think what I think is very important about all of these kinds of activities that we all get involved in is that they are relational. I think this is what you began by saying. They're deeply
Yes.
related.
Yes, exactly. And that is such a big piece of the vision for the Sophia Center, that people like, I'm just noticing Elizabeth Nelson is on, Marilyn Matthews are part of our faculty. It is coming together and saying it's really a vision and a commitment to the relational component of learning as well.
Yeah, I just want to go back to Kate.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't mean to talk down to you, but this is a very interesting thing that you find in the Jungian world where people are liberal politically, but they don't realize that to extreme people like me, there is a kind of hidden politics in this, for example, that the Hamas person is seen as inherently bad, and that which he stands against is seen, if not totally as good, but better. And I think that's the kind of thing. There is a colonization of the mind that takes place in Western societies. And you've got it big in America right now. Actually, we have here too. Unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
There is no independent mind. It's very difficult to have an independent mind. But these questions seem to have stopped. Yes. Oh, okay, Kate. Thank you.
So, Andrew, we are now, it's almost 10 after 12. Again, this has been just an amazing conversation, and I so appreciate your generosity in saying yes to my invitation to share with this community and a growing community of the Sophia Center, and I'm hoping it will, and I'm confident it will continue to grow. And I want to leave us with just a very short quote out of your book, where you write this, and I'm sure you probably want to comment on this after I share it, but you write this: ideals and visions are the only things that can undermine a toxic social order coming in on the side of the oppressed. Ideals and visions. And I think that concept of holding to a vision, however imperfect and holding the reality like you shared, and I think you're so well grounded, that realist side of we hold to an ideal of vision with the continued working awareness of our own flawed attempts at working towards that ideal.
It's all about the trickster. Tricksters deny reality. They deny the laws of time, space, and place. Why? Why do we have them doing this crazy stuff? Because it is one of the ways in which the social order changes. It is by denying realities that change comes about.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you. And, you know, it's work like the work that you are doing, others are doing, work that many of the people who are listening this morning and who will be listening are doing, that for me really continues to hold that candle of hope. The hope is in these very real conversations and in our own held awareness of our own flaws, our own imperfections, our own hangups, but our commitment to hold on to, I think, a humaneness and a generosity of humaneness and compassion with and for each other, not just those in our own wheelhouse and in our own silo, but continuing to do that. So thank you for your work, your vision, your scholarship, and for spending a late Saturday afternoon with us here on this side of the
Well,
pond, Andrew.
I'm just off to see Samuel Beckett's apocalyptic vision play Endgame. Google it, and you'll see where I'm coming from.
All right, that may be our next conversation. So enjoy Endgame, and we will probably come up in another conversation, Andrew. Thank you, everyone who's on with us. You will find this recording on the Sophia Center website, www.sophiacenter.com. So you can feel free to share with your friends, pass the word, and get to that conference Andrew's talking about. Thank you again, Andrew. Take care. Bye, everyone. Have a wonderful
Bye.
Saturday. Bye-bye.